It was the fall of 2022 when everything changed. I had just moved to a new apartment in the outskirts of Guadalajara, Mexico, a quiet area where the urban sprawl had barely begun to encroach on the old cobblestone streets. I was excited about my new job at a local craft store, but I never expected the stress of work to spiral into something that would change my life forever. The job was demanding. Every day felt longer than the last as I was pulled in every direction by preparations for the upcoming Dia de los Muertos festival, as well as the madness of the holiday season. I had barely been able to take a breath. Of the holiday season, I had barely been able to take a breath. One evening, after an exhausting shift, I finally walked through the door of my new apartment around 11:30 p.m. The apartment was small but cozy, and the cold Mexican night air crept through the cracks of the window as I threw myself onto the bed. The warmth of the blankets was a relief, and I sighed deeply, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the anxiety that had been building in me all week. The light from the street lamps outside painted faint shadows on the walls, and there was an uncomfortable quiet in the room that I couldn't ignore. Something felt off. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just exhausted. I turned over and checked the time, 11:47 p.m. I set my alarm, closed my eyes, and let the sleep consume me. But before I could even reach the deepest point of slumber, something disturbed me. A faint ticking noise echoed through the room, like the sound of an old-fashioned clock. At first, I thought it was just the alarm clock beside my bed malfunctioning. But when I reached out to turn it off, I was startled to find the clock wasn't the source of the noise. The room was bathed in a strange light, and when I opened my eyes, everything around me had changed. My bedroom was gone. Instead, I was lying in a room that looked nothing like mine. The wallpaper was a pale yellow, with faded floral designs, and the furniture had a distinct 1970s vibe to it. Old-fashioned chairs and a dresser that seemed too large for the space. My stomach churned as I realized that the walls were bare, with nothing familiar to me. I sat up in a panic and noticed a faded calendar on the wall. It read November 1976. I couldn't comprehend it. My breath quickened and I checked the time on my phone, but it showed nothing but static. The air smelled of something stale, like dust and old books. I reached for my phone to call for help, but before I could, I heard a voice from another room. "Anna, are you awake? We need to get going. The car is waiting." The voice sounded like a woman, but I didn't recognize it. I stood up shakily, my heart racing. Who is Anna?" I whispered to myself, confused and terrified. I opened the door cautiously, only to find myself facing a hallway that looked more like a scene from an old movie. The walls were lined with family portraits, and there were strange noises coming from what I assumed was the kitchen. My legs felt like jelly as I walked toward the source of the voice, unable to make sense of what was happening. I was trapped in a world I didn't belong to. Just as I stepped into the living room, a little girl with blonde braids appeared in front of me. She looked at me expectantly, her eyes wide with worry. "Hurry, Anna! Mum says we're going to be late," she said, her voice sweet, but with a tinge of urgency. "Anna?" I repeated, my throat tight. "Who are you?" The girl cocked her head to the side, confused by my question. "I'm your sister, silly. You've been acting weird ever since you hit your head." She tugged on my sleeve, trying to pull me toward the door. A sense of dread gripped me as I followed her, my mind spinning with questions. Who was this girl? What was happening? As I passed by the door, I noticed a woman standing in the kitchen. She was about my age, with short brown hair, wearing a faded blue dress. She looked at me and sighed, clearly impatient. "Anna, what's taking you so long? We need to leave now. We can't miss the car." "I'm not Anna," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not anyone you know." But she didn't hear me, or perhaps didn't care. She grabbed my arm firmly and started leading me to the door. My thoughts raced as I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Nothing was familiar. Not the furniture, not the voices, not the faces. I was in someone else's life. As the woman hurried me into the car, I noticed the clock on the wall again. It was still 1976. My head was spinning. I couldn't think straight. Was I dreaming? Was I losing my mind? The car ride was tense and uncomfortable, and I couldn't help but feel that something terrible was about to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape, and that feeling only deepened when, just as we were driving out of the neighborhood, a car came barreling toward us at full speed. A screech of tires, a loud crash, and then everything went dark. And then I woke up, in my bed. It was the same apartment, the same room, but it was 2022 again. My heart was racing, and my mind was still trying to piece together what had just happened. Was it a dream, or was it something else? The sound of my alarm clock filled the room, and I sat up, gasping for air, still unsure of what reality I was in. This was only the beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me as I lay in my bed, the familiar hum of the modern world surrounding me, but my mind was elsewhere. Had I just experienced some kind of vivid nightmare? Was my body playing tricks on me, or had I truly slipped into a different time, a different life? I wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but the more I thought about it, the more my mind insisted that it hadn't been a dream. The details were too vivid, too real. The taste of the stale air, the creak of the old floorboards, the faint smell of tobacco that lingered in the house. I had to know more. The morning after I woke up in my apartment, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I took a deep breath and carried on with my usual routine, getting ready for work, checking my phone for emails, forcing myself to drink the coffee that felt more like tar than anything else. But nothing felt normal. My thoughts kept drifting back to the strange house, the woman who insisted I was Anna, and the little girl who called me her sister. It was all so wrong. I went to work, keeping my head down, trying not to let the unsettling feeling gnaw at me. I couldn't tell anyone about it. Not yet. People would think I was crazy, and I wasn't ready to be locked away in some psychiatric ward just because I had a strange experience. Still, the thought of that house, of those people, kept creeping into my mind. During lunch, I decided to take a walk outside the store to clear my head. I walked down the cobblestone streets, letting the warm sun hit my face. The bustle of the city seemed so far away from the horror I had experienced. I passed by familiar shops and old buildings, the sound of distant music and chatter filling the air. But as I rounded the corner of a narrow alleyway, something caught my eye. A small, weathered bookstore stood at the end of the alley, tucked between two apartment buildings. The sign above the door read, "Libros Antiguos," in faded gold letters. There was something about it that called to me. I wasn't a huge reader, but the sight of the dusty windows and the smell of old paper seemed to pull me in. As if by instinct, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The bookstore was dimly lit, the shelves crammed with old leather-bound books. It smelled of age, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. I wandered aimlessly between the rows of books, running my fingers over the spines as I went. And then I saw it. A photo album tucked away on the top shelf of an old wooden cabinet, half hidden behind a pile of books. The album was worn, its edges frayed, and the cover was cracked from years of use. I pulled it down, curious. The moment I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. The pages were filled with black and white photos, faded images of people I didn't recognize. But the first photo I saw made my stomach drop. It was a family photo, taken in front of a house that looked strangely familiar. The people in the photo seemed like they belonged to another time, a time far removed from the one I knew. The woman in the middle, her hair pinned up in a tight bun, was wearing a dress that looked straight out of the 1970s, and beside her, a little girl with blonde braids stood smiling. I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. The woman was dressed exactly as I had seen the woman in the house from my dream, and the girl looked so much like the one who had called me Anna. I quickly turned the page, my hands trembling and my breath grew shallow. The next photo was of the same woman and girl, but this time they were standing beside a man, a tall man with a serious expression. The caption read, "Maria, Anna and the Family, 1974. I froze. That was the year I had seen on the calendar in the house. The album had a few more pictures, all showing the same woman and the little girl, but nothing could prepare me for the next photo. It was a family portrait taken outside the same house, but this time the scene was darker, almost tragic. The woman, Maria, was holding the little girl's hand, but there was something wrong. The man who had been in the previous photos was missing, and instead there was an empty space beside Maria. Suddenly, a voice broke through my thoughts. "Curious about the past, aren't we?" I jumped, startled by the old man who had appeared beside me. He was the shopkeeper, his weathered face a mask of quiet wisdom. "That's an interesting album," he said, his voice raspy. "You've seen that family, haven't you?" I was speechless for a moment. "How do you know?" I managed to say. The man smiled sadly. "You've been touched by their story. They were just like you, living a normal life until it all changed in an instant. You've seen what happened to them, haven't you?" I swallowed hard, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. "What happened to them?" I asked. The man's eyes grew distant and he shook his head. "A tragic accident, a crash that took them away from this world. But their spirits, their memories, they remain tied to the place where they once lived." I felt a strange shiver run down my spine. "The crash?" He nodded, his face grave. "Yes, it happened in 1974. A drunk driver lost control and crashed into their car. The mother and daughter, they never made it. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. This wasn't just some old family story. It was the story of the people from my dream, or whatever it had been. The woman who called me Anna, the little girl, the house, they were real, or had been at least." Are you saying their ghosts are still around?" I asked quietly. The shopkeeper's eyes darkened. "Some things can never truly leave. Their spirits have been trapped, wandering between worlds, and now they've found you." I recoiled in fear, the weight of his words sinking in. My mind was racing, but I didn't know what to think or believe. Was this a coincidence, or was I truly being drawn into the world of the dead? The man gave me one last look. "If you want to understand what happened to them, you'll have to finish the journey they started," he said. And with that, he turned away, leaving me standing alone in the shadowed bookstore, my heart pounding. The shopkeeper's words echoed in my mind long after I left the bookstore. "You've been touched by their story. Their spirits have been trapped, wandering between worlds. And now, they've found you." What did that even mean? I had no idea what kind of connection I had with those people, but something was pulling at me, a force that felt far beyond just a bad dream or coincidence. The rest of the day felt surreal. I went through the motions, answering emails, making phone calls, and doing my best to seem like I was functioning, but every time my mind wandered, it returned to that old photo album and the strange family that had somehow become tied to my fate. Maria, Anna, the little girl who called me by that name, everything about them felt like it was meant to cross my path. I could feel them lingering just outside the edges of my thoughts, like shadows waiting to consume me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. I had left the bookstore with more questions than answers, and the mystery of the tragic accident that had taken Maria and Anna haunted me. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the mounting sense of dread. My phone lay on the nightstand, its screen dark, but I couldn't help glancing at it every now and then. There was a strange pull, like I was waiting for something or someone to contact me. Finally, at around midnight, my phone buzzed, breaking the silence. I jumped, startled, and grabbed it quickly. The message was from an unknown number. The text was simple but chilling. "Meet me at the old house tomorrow night. I know you have questions. If you want answers, you have to come." My heart skipped a beat. The old house, the one from the photos, the one that had seemed so familiar to me, the one I had seen in the past life, or dream, the place where Maria and Anna had lived. How did this person know about it? Was this part of the trap the shopkeeper had warned me about? Or was this the chance I needed to finally uncover the truth? I didn't even hesitate. Despite every ounce of rationality telling me to avoid this madness, my curiosity and something deeper inside compelled me to agree. The messages stopped there, leaving no further explanation. My heart raced as I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the door, telling myself that I'd be back in an hour. The drive to the old neighborhood felt longer than it should have. My headlights cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the empty streets. The houses along the road appeared abandoned, their windows boarded up, their paint chipped. It was as if the entire place had been forgotten by time itself. And then I saw it. The house stood at the end of the street, just like in the photos. The architecture was old, the wood weathered, but it had a strange, unsettling beauty to it. It looked frozen in time, as if it had never moved forward from 1974. The porch light flickered on and off, giving the house a haunting, ghostly appearance. I parked my car in front of the house and sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. My heart pounded in my chest, the cold night air creeping into the car. Was this a mistake? Should I turn around and leave? But something inside me urged me forward, pushing me to discover whatever was waiting behind that door. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the house. The closer I got, the more I could feel an oppressive energy in the air, like the weight of history was pressing down on me. It was as though the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. When I reached the front steps, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorbell. But before I could press it, the door creaked open on its own. A voice echoed from inside, soft and distant. "Come in." I froze. It was a woman's voice, familiar but not. It reminded me of Maria, the woman from the photos. But this voice was cold, empty, like it had been pulled from the depths of time. I stepped inside cautiously, the door closing behind me with a thud. The air inside was thick, heavy with dust and the musty scent of abandonment. The old house was exactly as I remembered from the photos, faded wallpaper, wooden furniture, and old paintings lining the walls. But there was no sign of life, no warmth. It was as though the house was a tomb, frozen in a moment long ago. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here?" No answer. I stood there in the darkness, unsure of what to do next. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked deeper into the house. I could hear whispers now, faint and distant, like they were coming from another room, or maybe from another time altogether. The voices were muffled, as if the walls themselves were trying to keep them locked away, but I could catch snippets of words that made no sense and yet seemed so familiar. As I turned a corner, I found myself standing in front of an old dining room. The room was large and dimly lit by the faint glow of a single candle on the table, and sitting at that table waiting for me was a woman, Maria. She was exactly as I had seen her in the photos. The same dress, the same hair, the same vacant expression. She looked up at me, her eyes cold and lifeless, as if she hadn't aged a single day. "I knew you would come," she said. her voice soft but chilling. "You've been chosen just like I was. You've come to finish what we started." I felt a chill run down my spine as I took a step back. What did she mean by that? What was she talking about? Before I could say anything, the lights flickered and the room seemed to darken. The whispers grew louder, now swirling around me like a storm. And then the little girl appeared, Anna. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sadness. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then everything went dark. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, as if I had been holding my breath for far too long. My surroundings were blurry at first, the edges of reality slowly coming into focus. I was no longer in the old house. I was back in my car, parked on the side of the road. The night was still thick with darkness, but my mind was racing with confusion. How did I get here? What happened inside that house? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but the answers were elusive. The last thing I remembered was standing in front of Maria and Anna, then nothing. I could still feel the chill of their presence, the weight of their eyes on me, but I couldn't understand what they wanted. My heart pounded in my chest as the sensation of dread clung to me like a shadow. I checked my phone again, hoping for some sense of normalcy. The time read 2:12 a.m. It hadn't changed since the last time I checked. The drive here had been disorienting, but I had no recollection of the events leading up to this moment. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it had all been a nightmare, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something far worse was at play here. Without any clear direction, I drove back to my apartment, each turn and stoplight feeling like a small eternity. The streets were eerily quiet at this hour, and my headlights cast long shadows as I made my way home. I parked in my spot and stared at the entrance of the complex, uncertain of what to do next. Inside, my apartment felt different. The air was heavy, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. The silence in my apartment was deafening as I sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself. I needed to process everything that had happened. But my mind kept coming back to one thing. The phrase Maria had said before everything went dark. "You've come to finish what we started." The words echoed in my head like a haunting refrain. What did that mean? Was I supposed to finish something? And who was I supposed to finish it for? The spirits? Or was it something more? My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. I stood up abruptly, my heart skipping a beat. Who could it be at this hour? Hesitantly, I approached the door and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. I sighed, shaking my head. It was probably just my nerves playing tricks on me. But as I turned away, something caught my eye. There, on the floor in front of my door, lay a small, neatly folded piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. The paper felt old and brittle, its edges frayed from years of wear. Unfolding it carefully, I read the single sentence written in a slanted, hurried handwriting. The accident was not the end. It was just the beginning. I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They were more than just a cryptic message. They felt like a warning, or perhaps a command. I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Whatever had happened at that house, whatever connection I had to Maria and Anna, it was only just beginning to unfold. The feeling of being watched washed over me once more. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But the street was empty, the shadows long and still. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes upon me. I needed answers. I had to find out what this all meant, what was happening to me. And to do that, I knew there was only one place I could go. The old house. But how? The memories of the house, of Maria and Anna, were already slipping away from me, as if they were fading with each passing second. I wasn't sure how long I had before I would forget everything, or worse, before the spirits would make their final claim on me. But I couldn't just sit here and wait. I had to find them. That night I fell into a restless sleep, but even in my dreams, the whispers continued, the same phrases, the same voices. Finish what we started. I woke up just before dawn, my mind racing. It was time to go back to the old house. I didn't care how dangerous it was or how crazy it seemed. There was something calling me there, something I couldn't explain, and I had no choice but to answer it. I grabbed my jacket, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I had to go now. I didn't know what would happen if I waited, but I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't be good. Driving back to the house felt like a blur. The roads, the houses, everything around me seemed to twist and bend, as if the world itself was warping to match the nightmare I had somehow fallen into. I kept my eyes on the road, trying not to let the panic take over. The house was waiting, it always was, and whatever answers I needed, I was going to find them there. I pulled up to the familiar street, the house looming at the end like a dark, sentient force. The porch light flickered again, just like before. My pulse quickened. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, my legs trembling. The air around the house felt colder this time, as if the very atmosphere had become charged with something dark and ancient. I didn't know what I was going to find when I entered, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to leave until I had answers. I walked up the steps and reached for the door handle. This time, it opened without hesitation. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for me, as though it knew I would come back. The air inside the house was thick, suffocating, and the familiar scent of old wood and dust hit me like a wall. The light flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, warping and distorting as I took my first cautious step inside. My heart was racing, each beat heavy with a sense of foreboding. Everything was exactly as I remembered. Nothing had changed. The furniture, the wallpaper, the old pictures hanging crookedly on the walls, it was all still there, trapped in time. Yet, something felt off. Something about the stillness in the house was unnatural, like it was waiting for me to make a move, to acknowledge its presence. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves, but every step felt like it carried a weight I couldn't shake. "Maria? Anna?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, only the sound of my own breath echoing in the silence. The house felt like it was holding its breath too, as if it were anticipating my next move. I made my way through the living room, my eyes darting nervously to every corner. The walls seemed to close in on me with each passing second, and the air grew colder, making my skin prickle. I reached the staircase that led up to the second floor. My feet hesitated at the base, but something inside me pushed me forward. I had to go up. I had to find out what was happening, and I wasn't going to let fear stop me. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, each step sounding like a warning, like the house itself was trying to protest. At the top of the stairs, I paused, unsure of which direction to go. There were 3 rooms down the narrow hallway, each one as dark and silent as the next. The memories of the night before came rushing back. Maria's voice, Anna's innocent face, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the sense that they were still here, somewhere in this house, waiting for me to uncover their story. I turned to the room on the left, the one I hadn't explored before. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin sliver of light escaped from the crack, casting a dim glow onto the floor. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was eerily still. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched, and the air felt colder here, as if it had been preserved in time. But something was different about the walls. They weren't the same pale color they had been last time. The wallpaper, now peeling and faded, revealed strange symbols etched into the plaster beneath it. Symbols that looked ancient, like they had been there for decades. I ran my fingers over the markings, a chill running down my spine. These weren't just decorations, they were warnings, markers of something dark. A voice echoed in my mind, faint but growing clearer with each passing second. "You shouldn't have come." The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the room was empty, the air thick with a silence that seemed almost oppressive. My pulse quickened and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wasn't alone here, I never had been. I backed out of the room, my eyes scanning the hallway once more. The walls felt like they were pressing in on me, and the temperature in the house had dropped so much that I could see my breath fogging in the air. A sudden movement caught my eye, a shadow slipping just beyond my line of sight. I whipped around, but nothing was there. The hallway remained still, too still. I turned to the next room, the door to the right. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, but the door suddenly swung open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me to touch it. The room inside was dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, some of which were missing, their pages yellowed with age. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned mirror, the glass cracked in several places. But it wasn't the mirror that caught my attention. It was the figure standing in front of it, a woman. She was tall, with long black hair that cascaded down her back like a dark waterfall. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel her presence, as if she was staring right through me. I froze in place, my blood running cold. The woman in the mirror didn't move. She just stood there watching me, her presence suffocating, her gaze intense. Then, as if sensing my fear, the woman spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was filled with a heavy, haunting sorrow. "You shouldn't have come here, not now, not when it's too late." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air around me felt thick, like it was closing in. My head spun and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. My legs felt weak, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. The woman's figure began to shift, her features becoming clearer in the dim light. I could see her face now, her eyes hollow and dark, her expression twisted with pain. She smiled at me, an unsettling, cruel smile, and then everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was back in the hallway, my hand still gripping the doorframe of the room. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the room felt colder than ever. I could still feel the woman's presence, as if she had never left. The whispering in my head grew louder, as if the house itself were trying to tell me something important. But I couldn't understand it. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the old wooden floor. But as I reached the stairs, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, like the house was alive, twisting and warping around me. I stumbled, almost falling, but I managed to catch myself. The house was trying to stop me, to keep me here. When I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. My hand gripped the doorknob, twisting desperately, but the door remained stuck, as if it were glued shut. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. I could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating me, drowning me in its grip. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it was all I could hear. "You shouldn't have come here." And then I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one ringing in my ears like a drumbeat, hollow and deafening. I could feel the air growing colder around me, a bitter chill that crept up my spine and made my skin break out in goosebumps. I had to get out of here, but no matter how hard I twisted the doorknob, the door wouldn't budge. My pulse raced, and my breaths came out in shallow gasps. There was something behind me, something close, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my feet frozen to the ground, as if the house itself was holding me captive. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that smothers you, the kind that makes every second feel like an eternity. My throat was tight with fear, and I knew deep down that turning around would only make things worse. But I had no choice. I had to know what was there. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head, barely able to move, like my body was betraying me. The hallway was still, empty. But I felt it, something lurking just out of sight, hiding in the shadows. I took a hesitant step back, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. The same one I had seen in the room upstairs, but this time, it was standing in the hallway, facing me. The cracked glass reflected the dim light of the house, but the reflection was different, distorted, as though something was trying to break through. My heart skipped a beat. There, in the reflection, I saw her again. The woman from before. She was standing right behind me, her eyes locked onto mine, her face twisted in agony. Her lips moved, but no sound came from her mouth. I could see her trying to speak, the words lost in the air between us, her expression one of desperate pleading. My breath hitched in my chest, and I turned around expecting to find the hallway empty, but it wasn't. The woman was standing right there, inches away from me. She was pale, her skin almost translucent, her black hair matted and hanging in tangled clumps around her face. Her eyes were wide and hollow, empty sockets where the life had long since drained away. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers cold as ice. And for a moment I thought she might touch me, but before I could react, her hand passed through me as if I were made of air. I stumbled backward, my body crashing into the wall. I gasped, my mind spinning. Was she a ghost? A figment of my imagination? But no, I could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with a sense of loss and despair. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it sent a wave of terror crashing through me. Her words seemed to linger in the air, echoing around me, wrapping themselves around my thoughts. "Why did you come to this place?" I couldn't answer. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The woman's gaze never wavered. Her eyes seemed to pierce through me, seeing something I couldn't understand, something deep inside my soul. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying me, and then her lips curled into a smile. It wasn't a comforting smile, nor was it friendly. It was something darker, something that sent a cold shiver through my entire body. "You shouldn't have come," she repeated, her voice now filled with an eerie calmness. "Now you're part of this place. You can't leave." The words sank in, wrapping themselves around my thoughts, tightening their grip until I could hardly breathe. What did she mean? Part of this place? My heart raced and I took a step back, my eyes flicking nervously to the door. I had to get out of here. I had to. The house groaned. It wasn't a sound I had heard before, but it was unmistakable. The walls shuddered and the air around me thickened, as if the house itself were alive, shifting and breathing. I turned back to the door, and this time I knew I wouldn't be able to open it. The woman's warning echoed in my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. "You can't leave," I tried again, desperate. I twisted the doorknob with all my strength, but the door remained locked, as if it had become part of the house's twisted grip. The woman stepped forward, her feet making no sound as she moved, her presence growing stronger, more oppressive. "Please, please don't," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. "I just want to go home." She didn't respond at first. Instead, she reached out again, her cold fingers grazing my cheek. The touch sent a jolt of ice through my body, and I recoiled instinctively. Her fingers lingered for a moment longer, almost as if she were trying to comfort me, but it was a false comfort, one that only deepened the terror growing inside me. "You don't belong here," she said softly, her voice now a strange mixture of sorrow and anger. "But you will. You'll stay, like the others." Her words hung in the air like a curse, and I felt my stomach twist in horror. The others? Who were the others? What did she mean? I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the house groaned again, louder this time. The darkness in the hallway seemed to deepen, stretching out like a living thing, creeping toward me with each passing second. I looked back at the woman, my mind racing. What had happened to her? Why was she trapped here? And why was I now a part of this nightmare? Her eyes were locked onto mine, pleading, but there was something else there too. A warning that I couldn't ignore. "You will stay," she whispered, the words chilling me to the bone. I tried to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. The shadows around me seemed to wrap themselves around my ankles, pulling me back. The woman's form grew hazy, fading into the darkness, and then everything went black. I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness around me thick and oppressive. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious, but the feeling of dread was still heavy in the air, clinging to my skin like a second layer. The room was cold, too cold, and my hands trembled as I pushed myself off the floor. I had fallen. Somehow I had fallen. My legs felt unsteady, like I hadn't used them in years, and I stumbled toward the nearest light switch. When I flicked it on, the harsh white light flooded the room, but it didn't comfort me. It only made everything feel more real. I was in the same place, the same house. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive, breathing with me. I ran my fingers along the edge of a dusty table, and the thick layers of dust came off in clumps. I was in a room I hadn't seen before, large, with antique furniture that felt out of place. It was like stepping into a different time, a different era entirely. The wallpaper, yellowing with age, had a pattern I recognized. It was exactly like the one I had seen in the hallway before, but here it was faded and peeling, as if it had been here for decades. I turned toward the window, hoping for a glimpse of the outside world, but the glass was fogged up. I wiped it with my sleeve, but it didn't make a difference. There was no light coming from outside, only an endless, suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. It was like I was trapped in a void, cut off from everything I knew. The air was thick with a strange smell, a mix of decay and something floral, like old perfume clinging to the walls. I felt my stomach turn, the bile rising in my throat as I tried to steady myself. There was no time to think. No time to understand what was happening. I had to get out. I had to escape this place before it swallowed me whole. As I turned to the door, I froze. The woman's voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, more insistent, and it sent a shiver running through me. Lena. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, my mind racing. It was her again. The woman, the one who had haunted me, who had followed me through the house. I had hoped it was a dream, that it would fade away, but now it felt more real than ever. Her figure materialized before me, stepping out from the shadows, her cold, pale hands reaching for me. Her face was the same, hollow eyes, blackened skin, her lips curled in that twisted smile. But there was something different now. She was more solid, more present, as if she had somehow crossed over from the darkness and into the light. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice thick with sorrow. "You've seen too much now." I backed away, my heart racing. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she regarded me. "I'm the one who's been trapped here just like you," she whispered. "I was just like you once, living my life, going through the motions. But then I stepped into this place and I couldn't get out, and now you're here with me." I shook my head, trying to make sense of her words. She was speaking in riddles, in half-truths. "No, I'm not like you. I'm not staying here. I'm leaving." Her expression shifted, the sorrow in her eyes turning to something darker. "You don't understand, do you? This house, it doesn't let you leave. It keeps you forever." I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. "That's not true. I'm leaving. I just need to find the way out." The woman's smile faded, replaced with a look of deep regret. "You've already seen too much. You're part of it now. You can't escape what's been set in motion." I turned away from her, determined to find a way out. But before I could take another step, I heard it. The sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if something was coming for me. I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound was unmistakable. My body went rigid with fear, and I turned back to the woman. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What's going on?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked past me, her face filled with fear, her eyes wide, as if she had seen something that terrified her. I followed her gaze, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. Yet the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the hallway was still empty. "Lena!" The voice called again, this time from just behind me, a low, guttural whisper that sent a chill down my spine. I turned too quickly, too desperately, and there was no one there. But I could feel it. I could feel the presence, something looming just behind me, watching me. My pulse raced as I backed away, my feet stumbling against the floorboards. The woman's face twisted in horror. "It's too late. You can't escape," she whispered. But before I could respond, everything went black again. I woke up in a cold sweat, my breath shallow and quick, like I had just sprinted a mile. My entire body was trembling, as if I had been shaken awake by something I couldn't see. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the events that had just unfolded. After all, it seemed impossible. No one could be trapped in a house like that, right? Yet everything felt too real. My heart thudded in my chest as I scanned the room. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. The walls around me were unfamiliar, rough-hewn wood, the kind you would expect to find in an old cabin, not in a place like this. I sat up slowly, trying to shake off the feeling of vertigo that swirled in my head. The room was dimly lit, but I could make out the heavy shadows that loomed in every corner. I had no idea how I had ended up here, but something inside me told me I wasn't alone. I wasn't just in any house. This wasn't just a dream either. It was a nightmare I couldn't escape from. I pushed myself off the floor and wobbled to my feet. I felt sick, disoriented, like my body was out of sync with reality. My hands brushed against the rough walls as I took a few steps forward, looking for some sign of life, anything to tell me where I was or what had happened. My fingers brushed across a dusty table, and the touch sent a wave of dread over me. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mold and mildew, like this place hadn't been touched in years. A shiver ran down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. I had to focus. I had to get out. This place felt wrong, suffocating even. I needed to find the door, the way out. I stumbled across the room and reached for a handle on the far wall. My fingers wrapped around the cold, rusty metal, and I twisted, but it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, yanking at it with all my strength, but the door wouldn't open. Panic surged through me. I yanked at it again, slamming my shoulder into it, but it was like I was hitting a wall. I was trapped in this place, unable to leave. I stepped back, gasping for air, my heart racing. I turned in a slow circle, taking in the room again, my mind scrambling for answers. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever it was that had been stalking me. The floor creaked behind me, and I froze. Slowly I turned my head, half expecting to see the woman again, or worse, the thing that had been following me since I arrived here. But it wasn't her. It wasn't anything I had expected. A figure stood at the far end of the room, barely visible in the gloom. It was tall, thin, its limbs long and unnaturally stretched. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air around it seemed to crackle with a strange energy. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like a part of me already knew what I was seeing wasn't human. The way it stood there, silent, unmoving, sent a wave of nausea over me. It didn't belong here, in this world. It felt like it was something out of time, a creature that had slipped through the cracks and found its way into my nightmare. I backed away slowly, my body tense with fear, my heart hammered in my chest, and my mind screamed at me to run, to get away from the thing that was watching me, but there was nowhere to go. The room had no windows, no exits, just the door I couldn't open. My legs felt weak, as if the weight of the air itself was pressing down on me, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to move. Suddenly, the figure moved, its long limbs shifting in the darkness. I didn't see it coming. One moment, it was standing still, and the next, it was right in front of me, its face inches from mine. It was featureless, just a void where its eyes should have been, a smooth, pale surface that made my stomach churn. I screamed, a sound that came out like a choking sob. I stumbled backward, but my foot caught on something, and I fell to the ground. My body hit the cold floor with a sickening thud, and for a split second, I thought I had been knocked unconscious. But no, I was awake. I was very much awake. The figure was still there, looming over me, its form stretching impossibly long, as though the space between us was getting wider and narrower at the same time. It was like it was bending the very fabric of reality around it. The room seemed to warp and twist, and my mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. I had to get out of here. I had to find a way to escape before it consumed me, before the thing in front of me swallowed me whole. But as I tried to stand, my legs wouldn't obey. They felt numb, heavy, like I was sinking into the floor. My body was betraying me and I couldn't move. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It simply reached out a hand, long skeletal fingers like branches reaching for me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My eyes were locked on its outstretched hand, and the fear was choking me, suffocating me. Just before its fingers touched my skin, the world around me shattered. The walls, the floor, the figure, it all dissolved into darkness, and in that moment I realized, with chilling clarity, that this place wasn't a house. It wasn't even a nightmare, it was a trap. I woke up with a start, my body jerking upright as though I had been yanked from a deep sleep. The room around me was no longer the oppressive, claustrophobic space I had just been in. Instead, I found myself back in my apartment, drenched in cold sweat, my heart still racing as if I had just run a marathon. I gasped for air, trying to shake the images from my mind, the figure, the void where its eyes should have been, the twisting reality. It felt so real, so vivid, that I couldn't convince myself it had been a dream. I stumbled to my feet, feeling disoriented, as though I had just woken up in a different world altogether. The apartment was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the distance the only sound. I stood there for a few moments, trying to collect myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the more I tried to reason with it, the more my mind seemed to slip away from me. The silence was unsettling, oppressive even. I glanced around my apartment, trying to find some sign that everything was as it should be, that I hadn't somehow slipped into another dimension or time. But everything looked normal. My couch was exactly where it had been, my coffee table still cluttered with books and magazines, my kitchen untouched. It felt safe, but there was an underlying dread that crawled up my spine, a nagging sensation that something was terribly wrong. I sat down on the couch, rubbing my temples, trying to steady my breath. I had to focus. The figure, the house, the twisted sense of reality. I had to make sense of it all. But as I closed my eyes, I was assaulted by flashes of images, distorted memories, as though someone was scrambling the events in my head. It was like there were pieces missing, fragments of reality that didn't fit together, and amidst those flashes, one name kept echoing in my mind: Maria. I opened my eyes sharply, trying to shake off the strange sense of déjà vu that had washed over me. Maria. Who was Maria? I knew I had heard that name somewhere, but I couldn't place it. It was as if it had been embedded in my mind, as though my brain was trying to remind me of something I had forgotten. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out. I grabbed my phone and pulled up a search engine, typing the name into the search bar. But instead of the usual results, my screen flickered for a moment before a single article popped up. It was an old newspaper clipping from the 1970s, and the headline sent a chill through my body. Fatal accident claims the lives of 3, 1 survivor. The article was blurry, faded from age, but the details sent my blood cold. It described an accident involving a green station wagon, the kind of car that was popular in the 70s. The victims were identified as Maria, Susanna, and a little girl named Linda, my mother, my sister, and me. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry, my heart thundering in my chest. The article continued, describing how the family had been in the car on their way to meet the father, moving their belongings when the car had been struck by a drunk driver. Susanna and Linda had died on impact, and Maria, my mother, had died in the hospital days later. The only survivor, the article claimed, had been the driver of the other car, the drunk man who had caused the tragedy. Tears welled up in my eyes as the weight of the revelation crushed down on me. I knew these names. I knew these people. They were my family. People I had never met, never had a chance to know. But they were connected to me in a way that I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the apartment seemed to shrink around me. The air was thick, heavy with a presence I couldn't understand. I felt like I was being watched, like something was waiting just beyond my line of sight. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that everything I had experienced, the visions, the dreams, the strange house, had something to do with this family from the past. But there was no denying it anymore. I stood up, pacing the room in a panic, my mind racing. I had to figure this out. I couldn't let this strange connection swallow me whole. The article had mentioned a cemetery, an old burial ground near the edge of town where many of the victims of the crash had been buried. Could there be something there, some trace of my family's past that I had somehow been drawn to? I grabbed my jacket, not caring that the room still felt like it was closing in around me. I didn't know what I was searching for, but something in my gut told me I had to go to that cemetery. I had to see it with my own eyes, even if it meant confronting whatever was haunting me. As I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the night sky dark and heavy with clouds. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My footsteps echoed down the empty street, and the further I walked, the more I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me. Every corner I turned, every shadow that stretched across the pavement seemed to whisper my name. When I reached the cemetery, it was silent. There were no cars in the parking lot, no people wandering the grounds. The place felt abandoned, forgotten. I walked through the gates, my breath forming clouds in the cold night air. The cemetery was vast, rows of gravestones stretching into the darkness, and in the distance near the back of the property, I saw it, the stone marker that stood out from the rest. It read, "The Martinez family, Maria, Susanna, Linda." My knees nearly gave out beneath me as I approached the grave. The names etched in the stone were all too familiar. It felt as though time itself had bent to bring me here, to this exact moment. I didn't know what I was supposed to find, but the weight of it was unbearable. The air around me seemed to thicken, the graveyard suddenly feeling too still, too silent. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, whispering from behind me. "Linda." My heart nearly stopped. The voice, soft but unmistakable, lingered in the cold night air. "Linda." It wasn't just a whisper. It felt like it was being spoken directly into my ear, a breath against my skin. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The cemetery was as empty and quiet as before. My pulse thundered in my ears, and a cold sweat began to bead on my forehead. I wasn't alone. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the graveyard, my breath shallow and rapid. The moon was obscured by thick clouds, and the darkness around me seemed to swallow everything whole. For a moment I thought I had imagined it, that I had somehow conjured the sound in my mind. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The voice had been too real, too clear. I took another step backward, my foot catching on an uneven stone. I stumbled, my hands reaching out instinctively to steady myself. My fingers brushed against something cold, something soft. A hand. I gasped and jerked my hand away, my body frozen in terror. I dared not turn to look at what had just touched me, but the chill in the air had deepened. The cemetery seemed to have transformed from a quiet place of rest into something alive, something that could reach out and pull you into its depths. The oppressive silence was now broken only by the sound of my own frantic breathing. I spun around, my eyes wide and searching, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw her. Standing just a few feet away under the shadow of a large oak tree was a figure. She was barely visible in the low light, but I could make out the silhouette of a woman with long, dark hair. Her outline was faint, almost translucent, but her presence was undeniable. "Linda!" The voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. It wasn't just a voice anymore. There was an energy about her, a force that seemed to draw me in, like gravity pulling at my very soul. I knew who she was. I didn't need to ask. This was Maria, my mother, the woman whose name had been on that grave just moments ago. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. Her gaze, though distant and clouded, was fixed on me, like she had been waiting for me, perhaps for years, maybe even decades. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. Then, slowly, she began to move toward me. It wasn't a walk. It was more like she was gliding across the ground, her feet not quite touching the earth. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. I was trapped in place, caught in her gaze, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Her voice broke the silence again. "You've finally come back, Linda. After all these years, you finally returned." I opened my mouth, trying to respond, but no words came. It felt as if something was choking me, as if the air itself had thickened around me, making it impossible to speak or even breathe. The cold wind began to howl through the trees, whipping my hair around my face, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. Suddenly, everything shifted. The graveyard was gone. The cemetery, the gravestones, the trees, they all vanished, replaced by a completely different scene. I was no longer standing in the middle of the cemetery. I was inside a house, an old house, one I recognized. It was the house from the dreams, the same one where I had woken up earlier. The wallpaper, the furniture, the air that felt so wrong, it was all there again. And standing in front of me was Maria, her figure now solid, her face more vivid than I had ever seen it in my life. But this time, there was something else, something darker about her presence. The woman who had once been my mother was now twisted, her eyes clouded over with an unnatural, unearthly light. She reached out a hand toward me, and I could feel the overwhelming force of her sorrow, her anger, her desperation. "Why did you leave us, Linda?" she whispered, her voice trembling with grief and accusation. "Why did you leave me? Leave all of us behind?" My throat tightened and I tried to speak, but no words came. The house around us began to distort, the walls warping and shifting like they were alive, like the entire place was suffocating me. The air was thick with a sense of loss, of unfinished business, of something that had been left undone for far too long. "You can't escape, Linda," Maria's voice continued, becoming more guttural, more haunting. You can't run from what's been done. You'll never escape us. We'll always find you." Suddenly, a sharp, shrill cry rang out from the other side of the room, a sound so piercing that it made my head ache. I turned quickly, my eyes widening as a small figure emerged from the shadows. Linda, my sister, or the version of her that had died all those years ago. She was different now, too. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. She reached out toward me, but it was as though the air itself was keeping her from getting any closer. "Don't leave me, Linda. Don't leave me again." Her voice was barely a whisper, a soft plea that echoed in my mind long after it faded. In that moment, the weight of the entire tragedy hit me with full force. I was trapped, stuck in some twisted version of the past. The guilt, the anger, the sorrow, it all flooded me at once. I realize now that I wasn't just witnessing a haunting. I was living it. I had become a part of it, a part of the unfinished cycle that had begun the night of that terrible crash. As the figures of Maria and Linda began to close in on me, their voices blending into a cacophony of sorrow and anger, I realized something. There was no escape from this. Not now, not ever. I was part of their story. I was bound to them, and I had always been. The past could never truly die, no matter how much I tried to bury it. And as their cold hands reached for me, I understood that the spirits of my family had been waiting for me, for the return of the daughter who had never come back to claim them. I was their prisoner now, forever entwined in the web of time that had brought me back. The world went dark.